The world of flagship graphics cards is constantly changing, but it looks like we're finally at the point where some really quite powerful and quite modern stuff is now flying under the radar, so much so that they're now more or less worthless. Now this right here is my GTX 780 from Nvidia that I grabbed off CEX for just £12 a little while ago, which seemed like a miraculously cheap deal, which is why I went for it, as this territory I thought was purely reserved for cards like the GTX 480 and older units. But nope, with those cards now becoming classics in the world of computing, we're finally at the point where Kepler-based flagship cards are now worth nothing. Even in the world of eBay, they really aren't selling for all too much. It's anywhere between £10 to £30 depending on if anyone bothers to bid for them. But with a card this complex and this powerful, when you spend so little on one, does it actually work when you buy it? Well, after longer than I care to admit trying to actually plug this thing in, because it's so large that trying to stretch the power connectors into place could be its own montage in itself. Trust me, it's ridiculous how long I spent just trying to plug it in. The card turned on, powered up, and even displayed with some of the default Windows 10 drivers. Nothing too surprising given that this is still a relatively recent card. Well, no, turns out we're all actually getting old, and it's actually quite an old card itself, and this thing has a little bit of history going for it now. So why don't we wipe things back to a clean slate, get some drivers installed, and find out what actually was the GTX 780. Released 11 years ago now, back in May of 2013, this is an old card. But that doesn't mean it wasn't packing a punch back then. It offered a sizable uplift over the previous generation of cards, namely the GTX 680, and it was a huge leap, offering twice the performance on average of the Nvidia Fermi flagships, so GTX 480 and the 580. Thing is though, it wasn't cheap, releasing at an eye-watering £600 here in the UK, which somehow has become mid-range territory because I remember the price on this thing being almost an outrage when it released, but still here we are today. The only way this seemed reasonable at the time, keep in mind, was that this was not the cheapest card Nvidia offered. They did offer one higher up, which is the one that you'll all remember as the release of Nvidia's Titan card, which almost made this card seem reasonable in comparison, as at the end of the day, this is very much what this card was. It was the Nvidia Titan cut down. Think of it as a bit of a baby Titan card from Nvidia. So it had the same architecture, same basis, you more or less got 75% of a Titan for about half the price, sometimes even less. So it was a decent card when you looked at it that way. The thing is though, at the top end, there really was no competition against the GTX 780. If you wanted the best in terms of performance, at least back in 2013, there was only the Titan offering. AMD's offerings were cheaper, yes, and if you wanted to do 1080p or maybe some 1440p gaming, then they were definitely viable, there's no doubt about that. And everyone remembers that most people, well, AMD's HD 7970 was a go-to, and upcoming rebrands were certainly more than enough. But these cards, well, I'm not saying Nvidia was rubbing it in a little bit, because on the lower end there's no doubt you were going AMD, I'm sure plenty of us here did. But with the GTX 780, this card here, Nvidia was crushing the AMD offerings. Where they could show 1080p benchmarks, Nvidia was showing off 4K and even 5K gaming in reviews of this card, achieving playable frame rates at ultra settings, something that only Crossfire cards were able to achieve. So the idea that you could be doing 4K or 5K gaming with ultra settings on an Nvidia card that was accessible at the time is just downright ridiculous, and it's what they offered you, it's why these things got such a good reputation. As time went on though, it wasn't until AMD's release of the R9 290 finally gave this card some real competition. I mean, that had issues of its own, namely heat, and the reference cooler sounded like a leaf blower, but it left the GTX 780 as almost a sensible choice given the AMD's cards thermal issues, at least if you had the money to get your hands on one, because the AMD side was much better value. But now, years on, we all know the AMD cards aged very well, with their heavy bets placed on DirectX 12 and Vulkan taking off, finally allowing them to get ahead a decade later. But now, most if not all of these cards find themselves in the bargain bin segment, with most people on the low end saying, yeah sure, go out and buy a HD 7770 or HD 7970. But what about the Nvidia flagship? I mean, these cards are now underneath the radar so much that they match the AMD offerings on price. Surely a mini Titan can't be a bad bet if you really don't want to spend much on a graphics card and want to get something even just a little bit decent. So what are the specs of the GTX 780? Well, given its fearsome reputation from back in the day, it certainly has enough power to still sound relatively imposing today, being based on the GK110 version of the Kepler architecture. This card is an absolute unit, with 2,304 CUDA cores, 192 TMUs and 48 ROPs, paired with an enormous, at the time, 3GB of GDDR5 based VRAM. But it gets better than that. There's none of this ridiculously strangled memory bus, it's a huge 384-bit memory bus. It does boast support for Vulkan and DirectX 12, but nowhere near as well as the very compute-heavy AMD cards of the era, so games will run, but you won't be seeing any performance boosts here. It's even got NVENC support as well, and it has every right to be called a mini Titan just looking over the spec sheet. Drivers seem to be relatively up to date, but lack any optimizations and are mostly just security fixes. But the main thing, in the real world where these things are for sale, they are priced anywhere between £10 to £30, virtually anywhere in the world. So they are extremely good value for the specs you get on paper. Now that we've got everything all up to date here with the latest drivers that seem to have installed, and they're dated June 2024, but as I said, these things really haven't been a priority for Nvidia for a long time now. But does any of that really matter when what we want to know is, can the card that crushed the market 11 years ago still hold its own in the world of 2024, and has it finally been knocked off the top spot? And more importantly, if you bought one back in the day, do you really need anything better yet? Well, there's only one way we're going to find out, and that's going to be in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks with Red Dead Redemption 2, which I wanted to get at least 30 FPS in, and with a bit of time spent in the settings menu with some tweaks, we managed to achieve a good mixture of settings ranging anywhere from medium through to ultra depending on what the GTX 780 could handle, as some settings like foliage the 780 really did struggle with, as it simply just doesn't have enough VRAM to handle some of the more intensive areas of foliage, but other than that it was alright. And there's no DLSS to help out with here whatsoever, so this is entirely what the card can display at its native resolution. But eventually, in 1080p, throughout gameplay and the built-in benchmark, we managed to achieve slightly over 30 FPS for the majority of the time we played the game. And that number it wouldn't stray too far away from even when situations were intense. DirectX 12 or Vulkan gave us no performance change, as the card doesn't benefit from the use of either beyond it actually running the game. But so far, so good. Next up was Baldur's Gate 3, which ran okay using DirectX 11. Vulkan would see similar performance, but was generally about the same, so I opted for what the card runs best. And performance was okay. I'd imagine it'd be more questionable towards the end of the game where it gets intensive, but still, without dropping from full HD, we had the game looking pretty good. Some of the textures did look a little bit muddy, and between scenes there was definitely a slight hitch in places, but other than those minor gripes, things worked alright, looked pretty good, and shows that even the most recent of AAA titles can still just about run fine on what is now an 11-year-old flagship. GTA 5 ran really well, so well in fact that even with the game completely maxed out, I had to increase the resolution slider just to get the card to struggle a little bit, as in standard 1080p, well, we were seeing anywhere from 80 to 100 FPS a lot of the time. Still, with ultra settings being used and a 1.5 times resolution boost in place, the game pretty much ran bang on 60 FPS a lot of the time, with only slight momentary dips when things got really stressful. Not exactly a surprise, but it goes to show just what a powerhouse this was in the DirectX 11 era for games that are a good few years after this card came out. Even large lobbies in GTA Online, though, weren't too much of a struggle for the card, although our average did take a little bit of a hit because the game is a complete mess when you go online. However, the drop-off was nowhere near as severe as it can be with some other cards. It could be a bit sporadic in places when there were lots of explosions and the same players in the same place, but still nothing too dissimilar to that of single player. And even when you scaled things back to smaller lobbies under 16 players, well, performance didn't change too much there. So it's definitely a card that copes well with GTA Online. And it's nice to know that no matter how many players you've got on there, you can play the game relatively smoothly. Just you'll be under 60 FPS when you do actually want to go onto multiplayer. Mount & Blade Bannerlord was another title I wasn't expecting to run as well as it did. With the high settings selected across the board, the game ran at a pretty much constant 60 FPS under intensive situations, only dropping beneath this during some parts of the built-in benchmark. In actual gameplay, only late game battles, which were absolutely huge, caused some slight issues, but even then the frame rate never stopped being playable. It was mostly when loads of units were on screen and the camera sort of clipped between them, but generally the game ran alright. For most of the early to mid game you could see well over 60 FPS, which was always nice to see for such an intensive and good looking game that is now running on quite an old card. Fallout 4 still remains one of my most requested benchmarks, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like Kepler has any magic here, with Fallout suffering from its usual unstable frame rate. Despite this, the game looked alright and did run okay with the high settings selected, and outside busy locations you could see near the game's FPS cap of 60. But in towns and cities, specifically when in combat, there was sporadic utilization that could cause drops to the mid-40s for seemingly no reason other than this game being a bit of a mess. This game can be picky with what cards it likes to run smoothly on. I mean, as we've seen before, the best experience we've had was the game running in 480i. But I'd still go as far as saying that, as far as Fallout 4 running, things are smooth enough here. Brand new indie titles, as we've seen before, can definitely prove a challenge on a lot of cards, purely because they lack any optimizations mostly on the developer side, but also on the driver side where, Nvidia stopped updating these cards years ago and they definitely weren't expecting titles like Tavern Keeper. But anyway, as far as things stand in the world of indie games, we managed to run the game okay with medium settings at 1080p, and that allowed us to keep things over 60 FPS. This is actually better than a lot of cards usually manage here, probably because it's completely overkill for titles like this, but given we've got no optimizations whatsoever and this game is still early in alpha, it's nice to see it not doing too bad here. Another surprise though was Counter-Strike 2, which ran with some brilliant settings and achieved well over 100 FPS throughout the intensive benchmark. This could be even higher in game, and once again even higher than that in competitive scenarios. The frame rate was only liable to drop when there were lots of smokes and flames going on, and even then the drop wasn't dramatic at all compared to a lot of cards we see. It's also worth noting that this game, unlike some of the others we've tested, didn't give me a warning message about drivers being out of date, which it can do with some Nvidia cards. So it's likely that this game did actually get some sort of optimizations from Nvidia, which mean that for once, you can actually buy a cheap graphics card and have a genuinely competitive Counter-Strike playing setup. And that's all with an 11-year-old flagship. In terms of emulation, as it had always won people requests to see on the channel, we had Dolphin running The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker at a whopping 5K resolution, then downsampled to 1080p. This was also with enhancements made to anisotropic filtering and things like that, so for emulation, you can safely run any older title at ridiculous settings with no issues. BeamNG. We went straight into an intensive test as there was no point messing around with the simpler scenarios, as I already had a feeling this card would run them fine. So with one of the most intensive maps running and the high setting selected, we proceeded to see the game run with no issues. Keep in mind this is about as intensive as you can get for a benchmark scenario here, and even when we were averaging around 40 FPS, yes there could be certain dips into the high 30s, but that really isn't the end of the world for BeamNG. And in most other maps you'd be seeing well over 60 FPS, so for this title, that was a great success. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, yes, with no issues at all. At ultra settings, even in combat, you would just about stray under 60 FPS, and that is the worst it ever got. Throughout most of the normal gameplay, you'll be seeing well over that, and if you wanted a cheap card for running those classic titles, this is definitely not a bad shout. I don't doubt you could go higher in resolution if you really wanted, and you wouldn't run into any problems. These older titles will never have problems on a card like this, that was essentially built around the concept of DirectX 11, but has decent support for DirectX 10 and prior, so it's good to see that's still the case, even on the final drivers. As lots of people have said, you lose performance with the final Nvidia drivers for a lot of cards, but in my experience, especially with Fermi and now Kepler, it tends to run those classic titles just as well as it ever did. So there we have it, the benchmarks. And how would I say performance went today? Well, across the board, really solid. For a card that most people say was completely done for after Nvidia stopped optimizations, and who can forget the whole controversy over them apparently cutting performance when Maxwell became mainstream, and that ruined its reputation for years to come. But in reality, these cards have always had more than enough brute force that even in games that have no optimizations, on an architecture that has basic DirectX 12 and Vulkan support at best, they run fine. If you bought one of these 11 years ago, you still don't really have to upgrade if you're running things at 1080p. Sure, 4K and the likes were never really the aim of these cards, that was Nvidia showing off, but the performance you get today is so respectable and passable, and I'm sure we could have gone higher if we did drop the resolution a bit. I'm sure Red Dead you could get at a nice 60 FPS if you dropped that resolution scale, but to me that just seems wrong. Given the reputation and the resolutions that were pushed on these cards back when they launched, I wanted to keep things at full HD as a minimum, and it's good to see that it's still kicking there today. Across a few other benchmarks like 3D Mark's Time Spy, we saw that when fully loaded, temperatures never exceeded the mid-60s, and the power consumption hovered just over the 200 watt mark, so these things certainly can chuck out some heat and use some power. But even this fairly unexciting ASUS unit doesn't run into any problems when it comes to just getting rid of it. However, new things like the latest Steel Nomad benchmark simply won't run. They claim it's due to VRAM, but given I ran this on a GT1010 last week, I honestly just think the reason it doesn't run is because Kepler isn't up to the task of understanding or running some of the more complex calls in DirectX 12, given its minimal support. It places itself around modern cards like the GTX 1650, which I can entirely believe, but really, performance like this is better on a 780 because you've got that huge memory bus, which means unlike a lot of newer cards, even up to the RTX 4060 and things like that, you'd spend less time watching the assets pop in, which is nice to see. I mean, I do use an RTX 3050 and occasionally a 4060, but they do suffer with pop-in because of their limited memory bus, anyone will tell you. When you go to an old flagship like this, you simply spend your time enjoying the game rather than watching the assets fly towards you. It's not a major gripe with new cards, but it's one advantage these old ones have that often goes under the radar. So there we have it, the Nvidia Geforce GTX 780, a card that now finds itself in a mysteriously low-end segment of the market, taking the place of the now classic GTX 480. Seriously, this thing is still packing a punch and is in the segment of flagships no one wants. If you find yourself needing a spare GPU, or just need something that can manage modern gaming in a pinch, well, I doubt you can find much better on the Nvidia side right now for this level of money. While most people have been quick to get rid of it now, due to lacking driver support, which in reality doesn't seem to be as big of a hit as most people thought it'd be, given that DirectX 12 and Vulkan take that sort of, limit away, it's a nice card. I mean, and the power consumption and the power requirements, they seem fairly modest compared to today's flagships. I really feel like I have to go back and compare to the AMD options now, which find themselves either cheaper, like the 7970, which can go for next to nothing, or this card's equivalent, the R9 290, which now finds itself costing about the same. I hope you've all enjoyed this quick look back on Nvidia's mini Titan and the performance it can still offer today. I know I'll certainly be using this card in a project at some point. Whether or not it makes it to the channel, we'll wait and see. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and good night.